In 2017, the Wii U was dead. It had games, no doubt, but its seemingly purposeless gamepad and, with a few exceptions, lack of a killer title really hurt it, making it sell less than the Nintendo GameCube. However, releasing this year was the Nintendo Switch, the brand new hybrid console handheld, and alongside it as a launch title for the system was The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. Upon release, it quickly became one of the highest rated games ever. It was said to be the best open world game ever made, and for some people, it was the best Zelda game ever made. Breath of the Wild was praised so highly because of one shockingly simple reason. As an open world game, it placed its focus on the most important element: the world. The open world wasn't just a back of the box claim, it wasn't just something to add on so we can have more to advertise. The world was the game. The entire point wasn't to go here, follow an NPC, go here, climb up a tree, kill these bad guys, return the parts to the NPC from earlier, etc. It was to explore every inch of this densely packed Hyrule. The game gives you the goal of destroy Ganondorf, and after a fantastic tutorial area, nothing stops you from going straight to the castle and just doing it. Or, you could collect all the memories, climb up a mountain, go take down the Divine Beast, and sink hours of your time just walking around Hyrule Field, or gliding over it, or fighting enemies, or riding a horse to Kakariko, or farming Guardian parts to create ancient gear at the Akala Tech Lab. You could cut down a tree and use it as a bridge, freeze an enemy and use a leaf so it'll slide off a cliff, roll a boulder down a hill to hit a bokoblin. You could set some grass on fire to start an updraft, use your paraglider to float up and land with a powerful attack. Hell, you could climb almost every single thing in the game, meaning if you saw a mountain, you could climb all the way to the top. If you saw a cold area, you could either run through eating all the food you have to keep you alive, or you could find the gear that gives you cold resistance. Or you could just carry a fiery sword on your back, that works too. The amount of ways you could interact with the world was near limitless, so no matter where you went or what you were doing, there was near guaranteed entertainment and discovery. The main part of the game was not the characters or quests or really even the story, it was Hyrule. The combat encouraged experimentation with its limited arrows and durability system. If you use a weapon, it'll wear down until it inevitably breaks, forcing you to find a new one. The same goes for shields and bows. This made it so you couldn't just stick to one super strong weapon the entire time. You had to use different types, or electric weapons, or sneaking up behind enemies, or use your Galaxy Note 7 to grab a metallic crate and drop it on their head from high up. The music isn't some bombastic great theme of Hyrule, it's just the sound of the world with occasional melodious piano notes. There's no way that this game will ever feel old or antiquated, right? You are now on the Great Sky Island. This island is great at letting you teach yourself the game, which is what made the Great Plateau such a great tutorial in the first place. There really isn't any hand-holding or explicit instructions on how to do everything, but the game instead wants you to experiment and try things out on your own. It gives you the tools and a goal, but doesn't always tell you what to do with them. There isn't one way to solve everything. Every puzzle or challenge in this game can be done in multiple ways, and the game is more than happy for you to break it. This open-ended nature really makes repeating these puzzles or finding other ways to solve them fun, since if you try something, there's more than a likely chance that the game will allow you to do it, and there's no better way to break the puzzles than with the abilities. The main abilities are found within shrines in the Great Sky Island, once again similar to the Great Plateau. They are now upgrades to your Pura Pad, resembling a Nintendo Switch more than a phone or Wii U gamepad for obvious reasons. These abilities are fantastic. Almost every single one of them is better than the ones you had in Breath of the Wild. They're so much more useful. Ultra Hand is the obvious upgrade of Magnesis, and it's so much better. Instead of only being able to grab and move metallic objects, you can now grab, rotate, and attach any objects to any other objects, including things like weapons. It's so fun to play and toy around with. It's objectively more useful, especially when combining it with the new Zonai parts. These are gadgets like fans, wheels, rockets, and bombs that use up your energy cells, another new thing in this game. They make Ultra Hand and Fuse even more fun since you can do crazy things such as create flying contraptions or a car or a boat. You can do something as simple as attaching a fan to a log to make a raft, or create a robot that blasts beams and shoots cannonballs at your enemies while automatically locking onto them, or an entire multi-stage rocket. Fuse is great too. You can fuse items such as rocks, enemy parts to your shields, weapons, or arrows in order to give them extra strength or elemental power. Fuse is most useful in combat, so we'll talk about that later. Ascend started out as a tool that the developers would use when testing the game, but they decided to make it an ability since it's so convenient. It's great for climbing up places and getting out of caves. It doesn't really seem to break the game, and again, that's a result of its more open-ended design. You can do anything you want within the game's few boundaries, or outside if you use glitches. The last main ability is Rewind, and it's probably the least useful. That's not to say it's bad, especially for shrines. You can completely cheese them by moving an object with Ultra Hand, rewinding it, and then standing on top of it. But on the overworld, it's probably the most situational, and the other ones are often more useful. Its main use is rewinding on stones fallen from the sky, but those don't take you as high as you need to be, and you'd probably be better off using the towers. Auto build is found in the depths, and saves a lot of time instead of fiddling around with Ultra Hand every time you want to build something. It even gives an option to use Zonai, a new type of material found in the caves and depths. Speaking of caves and depths, let's talk about the world. The world in Tears of the Kingdom is amazing. First of all, it's massive. The sky was the new addition teased by the trailers, and it's pretty fun, but surprisingly underwhelming. Strong start, I know. The yellowish aesthetic of the sky is really nice to look at, but there aren't enough big sky islands as I'd hoped there would be. Seeing how awesome the Great Sky Island was, I just wanted more of them. The sky has some exclusive materials such as sky shrooms, and I think some fish. The sky is also the only place where you can find and fight constructs. These robotic soldiers used by the Zonai are good enemies for the tutorial, but that's pretty much their only use. They're incredibly easy otherwise. Flux constructs are bosses made up of cubes. We'll talk about them later. There are some islands in the sky that have a pond, a few fairies, and a Zonai bird. These islands kind of feel like filler, as their only purpose is to glide you off the island on a bird with some fans. And, fish, I guess. Other slightly larger islands include a spinny wheel thingy, a launcher, a place to deposit construct parts for Zonai parts, which is very useful, and a shrine. These islands are again slightly more useful, simply for the Spirit Orb and Zonai parts, but it still does not feel meaningful. Also, the best way to get into the sky is to either teleport or use a tower, neither of which feel natural. Most falling stones don't take you nearly high enough to actually get to one of the islands, so they end up feeling quite pointless. It would make sense for a game like Tears of the Kingdom to have more seamless transition upwards, like how easy and fun it is to jump down for the sky. Similarly, it's rare that you'll get up onto the surface from the depths without teleporting, since you simply can't use Ascend on the ceiling or something. The Thunderhead Isles is one of the larger sky islands, and it's pretty fun, but it's only one more island. The sky is no doubt great to play in, but Hyrule is really the best part of the game. When you're in the Great Sky Island, you can't see all of Hyrule. You can see the other sky islands and Death Mountain, but most of it is obscured by the clouds, and you'll void out if you try jumping down. After the tutorial, however, you're presented with a path down to the kingdom. You can finally see the full ground below you, the sinister gloom emanating from the castle, the mysterious chasms, and the green grass that isn't present in the sky. They added new stables, armor shops, everything. The geography of Hyrule Kingdom is slightly changed, and the game feels much more dense. The terrain also seems more varied, with different colors of grass and more plants and flowers instead of just plain green or plain brown. There are rocks fallen from the sky, new enemies and mini-bosses, structures, items, and buildings that have all changed after the upheaval. While it is the same map, so much is added and the game itself feels so different that it definitely feels new, and running, jumping, swinging your sword around Hyrule is by far the best part of the entire game. Besides all this, one of my favorite things to do was just look. I loved staring at the detailed landscape, the mountains and valleys, settlements, and the spiral-shaped glow from faraway shrines. The way the sun looked while it was rising with incredible color brightening the entire kingdom of Hyrule. Half the fun of climbing up a tall mountain was to simply look back down from the top and see just how much there was, thinking I could explore all of that, and it was all gorgeously detailed and wonderful, full of secrets. Have you played the game A Short Hike? It's one of my favorite games of all time, and I say this with the utmost sincerity. You play as a penguin named Claire, making your way up to the top of a mountain for cell phone service. There aren't any incredibly deep gameplay mechanics, there's no pinball minigame, no combat enemies, no final boss, no tutorial, but it's still one of the most fulfilling games I've played. You walk, climb, and glide around Hawk Peak, talking to the cute animal creatures with incredibly well-written dialogue. The entire point of the game is just to relax and walk around. Simply existing in the world is enough. It's a very small game, you can beat it in less than an hour, but it's so memorable. Again, the world is quite small, so it's strange to draw a comparison to Tears of the Kingdom, but something about this game gets close to replicating what A Short Hike does, and it's very impressive for it. Most of the trailer showed off the Sky Islands, but they didn't show the other large addition to the map, the Depths. The Depths is a dark, gloomy area below the surface of Hyrule filled with mysterious Zonite mines, statues, and creatures. The first time going into the Depths was really exciting, but it quickly became a bit boring. While there is some variety, most of it is the same mushroomy plant biome for a map as large as Hyrule itself. The mobs are almost all gloom variants of regular mobs, meaning if you get hit by them, you permanently lose those hearts unless A, you can eat food that takes away the gloom, or B, you go into the light. Both of these will allow the hearts to be restored, but will not restore them, so getting hit wastes more resources than normal, so it adds some difficulty. These light up the surrounding area, making it obviously much easier to traverse. It's no doubt fun to explore the depths, and of course it is different from the surface, but oddly enough, I find it lacks, well, depth. It's much simpler than the surface, and while I did expect that, they could have added more elements from the surface, such as more zonai structures, more variety in terrain and environments. The latter especially. Even once you light up the depths, it's not like there's anything memorable to look at, like the Dueling Peaks, the Death Mountain, Satori Mountain, the Great Plateau, and Faron, just to name a few. These memorable locations and fun exploration is what made walking around Hyrule so awesome, and the depths lacks that. It means while you can get gear and weapons and enemy parts and zonai and whatever you need, you don't get that sense of wonder nor scale while aimlessly wandering, hoping to find a light route so you can see your game again. It kind of just seems bland, which honestly sucks because there is so much there. There are mines full of zonite, you can get chests with fun armor and weapons, but I just find myself not wanting to go into the depths at all. It seems like a missed opportunity, but it's by no means bad. It's not offensively bad. It's not something you're awfully forced to interact with. But since the depth seemed like such a huge part of the game, it could have been fleshed out more. Overall, although I do have complaints about the sky and the depths, Tears of the Kingdom has to be one of the best video game worlds to explore ever, just because of Hyrule. 0 out of 10. In all 3 layers of the world, you are bound to get into combat. Tears of the Kingdom has the same combat system of Breath of the Wild, but with the game's new abilities, it is much, much better. One of the biggest and best changes to the combat is Fuse. Fuse basically fixes the combat system from Breath of the Wild, since as fun as it was, fighting enemies almost never gave you anything worthwhile. You could use monster parts for elixirs and also sell them for rupees, but they were pretty useless overall. Here, that is absolutely not the case. Now, since you can fuse parts to shields, swords, or arrows, it gives a whole new meaning to monster parts. Most notably, the different horns, fangs, and claws of monsters. The stronger the enemy, the stronger the part that you'll get to fuse with one of your own weapons, increasing their strength. It's honestly genius. It means even if you do break your weapons fighting enemies, it doesn't matter since you kill the enemy and you can just create a stronger one. You can fuse tails to create whips, different types of parts can have elemental bonuses, it's great. Another thing that's changed is the way you approach enemies in the first place. This one might not be for the best. There are a lot more arrows in the game, so once my stock got over 200, it hasn't really gone down. You will rely on your arrows a lot more than before, and I don't think it's that bad of a thing. It's not like you simply don't have to engage with enemies, but rather you have an easy way to take out a few, since this game does like to throw a lot more hordes of enemies at them. Being able to fuse to your arrow also means, guess what? More possibility in how you play, more options. Everything that this game does feeds back into the one thing that says you can choose how and what you want to do. Okay, the arrows might be a bit too much. Since you didn't have an insane amount of arrows in Breath of the Wild, the game forced you to approach enemies in different ways, such as sneaking up behind them or throwing objects on them. It's a bit of a shame that this game has so many more arrows, because while I do think having more than in its prequel was a good idea, it means you almost always have a reliable, efficient, and consistent way to kill enemies, somewhat discouraging experimentation, which is counterintuitive to the rest of the game's design. But if you want options, this game has options. Attaching a rocket to a shield, holding it, flying upwards, and landing with an attack. Freezing an enemy with a sword, then burning it with your shield. Attaching a bomb barrel to your shield and doing a shield jump into a group of enemies, then going into bullet time and shooting them. You can do this multiple times by switching shields. Doing this with the bomb flower instead of a bomb barrel. Fusing a beehive to your shield, wait for an enemy to attack it, and watch the enemy get hit by the bees. Building an ultimate death machine, using muddle buds to have enemies attack each other. There's kind of a lot to do. Enemies, at least from what I remember, appear a lot more in hordes, such as boss bokoblins, which are also fun to fight. Constructs are incredibly easy, and you can use their horns to get zonai parts at dispensers, which you can use to explore and fight more. Flux constructs are pretty creative bosses that have you using Ultra Hand to remove their main unit and whack it until it rebuilds itself. You get a core from defeating it, which is really creative, allowing you to fuse it with one of your weapons. It means you have a choice on whether you want it to be a one-handed blade, a two-handed blade, a stick, a shield, or a spear. You can even make a Queen Gibdo Guster. You can take an average or weak weapon and then fuse a gem to it to give it a magic elemental ability like the rods from Breath of the Wild. Every aspect of this game just feeds into itself to create a gameplay loop that has both incredible variety and endless replayability. Even 100 hours into the game, you'll still be finding things you didn't know about, new areas, new bosses, and new items due to the scaling system. As you gain more XP, the enemies level up to harder forms with more powerful horns, meaning it takes more effort to take them down, but more rewarding to do so. It's fun to try and use different tactics to take down strong enemies, or also just bully weaker ones in the funniest way possible. Building armed vehicles with Ultra Hand, cheesing almost every dungeon and shrine with Ultra Hand, rewind and ascend, lifting every rock and climbing every wall to look for Korok seeds, finally getting back into Korok Forest and pulling the Master Sword out of the Light Dragon while Link has a stupid buoy shield and buoy sword on him. It's amazing to play a game that just says, yes, you can do that. There's so many things that players will do. The 4 main quests are much more varied than Breath of the Wild, but it did feel a little repetitive while I was playing through them for the first and second time. It just takes a while to get to the dungeons, and I felt bored, especially during the Gerudo and Goron quests. The dungeons themselves are massively improved upon. The Zora quest was great. It was fun to return to Zora's domain, talk to the fish, and rid the domain of sludge. The part where you shoot the scales through the water drop was clever, and it was just a blast. I think I liked the fact that it took place all over the Zora region, not just the domain. It made it feel more real, which is weird to say. It felt not like a quest made exclusively for the player, but an ongoing investigation all around Zora's domain and above. There's nothing blocking you from getting on the floating scales island or talking to Jihado before you even meet Sidon. It makes the Zora feel more like a real community, which is really weird to say, but it works. The dungeon starts in the Zora Waterworks, an underground cave where you investigate the Beam of Light. It's very easy to cheese this section with Rewind and Ultra Hand, which is also very, very fun. You can then go on this long path in the floaty sky to the Water Temple, a fun yet painfully simple dungeon of sorts with a really mediocre boss fight. Despite this, the rest of the quest was really fun, and I have trouble choosing between this or the Rito as my favorite story quest in the entire game. The Stormwind Arc is my second favorite dungeon, and the story is my second favorite as well, in contrast to the really good story and lackluster dungeon of the Zora. The boss fight was also really cool, even though it lacked any challenge. Like, at all. Like, I don't know how all the dungeons, except for the Water Temple, which still looks great in its own right, are actually themed around the world, instead of sticking to the same Divine Beast aesthetic. It makes it much more interesting, since you never know what exactly the next one is going to be, or how you will get there. The Goron dungeon is in the depths, and is my favorite dungeon in the game. It gives you some Zonai parts to play around with, which is very fun. These dungeons, while definitely more elaborate than the shrines from this game and the first game, are still relatively simple and can be solved in numerous ways. If you're a fan of the traditional Zelda dungeons, like the ones from Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess, you're probably going to be disappointed with the seeming simplicity of them. But remember, Tears of the Kingdom is not a traditional Zelda game. Those linear games usually have better stories, better set pieces, and tighter pacing at the expense of player choice and freedom. Just because they're from the same franchise doesn't mean that they're the exact same game. They have different focus points and excel in different ways. The pacing in Tears of the Kingdom can mean you can be incredibly underleveled for one dungeon and completely overleveled for the next. However, choosing what to do in between dungeons and story elements is what gives this game most of its fun, since that is what you'll be doing for most of your playtime. These quests are pretty refreshing after the lame-ish Divine Beasts of Breath of the Wild, but they do feel a little repetitive after a while, especially since the game is much more dialogue heavy than its predecessor. This means that I've replayed the dungeons in Breath of the Wild many times, and even though those are even more formulaic than this game, it still doesn't feel as boring. Maybe playing so much Tears in such a short amount of time, or the fact that I would play Breath of the Wild with my friends, made the experience a little better for one and worse for the other. Replaying it made me appreciate the Zora quest even more, but the others were still somewhat boring. I hated the Minero dungeon, however. After finishing the 4 main dungeons, there's a 5th one in the depths near Faerun. You're sent there on another quest to do some stuff on the surface, before descending into an abandoned mine to build Minero. This one just seemed incredibly boring to me, and I would have much preferred if I could simply fight the final boss after Regional Phenomena, since both that and the final sequence are a very good length. I especially dislike having to fight the seized construct after the Demon King's army if you haven't gotten Minero, since it's incredibly hard to beat without her powers, and incredibly easy with them. It means you basically have to do the Spirit Temple, which I think goes against the very basic idea of the first game. You can also collect all the Dragon's Tears, essentially this game's memories. They're fun cutscenes to watch that give you a better idea of what's happening in this more complex story, and they're fun to dive down into. The story being so much more complex seemed like a difficult thing to balance on top of this game's ideas of ultimate freedom, but I don't know how else they would have done it, unless they made all of the story optional, which it still kind of is. However, I think the final boss more than makes up for this restrictive story. Instead of being a generic spider guy and then a Mario Party minigame with Dark Beast Ganon, it's an epic 1-against-1 duel against the Demon King Ganondorf himself. It's not that difficult, but it's incredibly climactic. It's very similar to the Phantom Ganon boss fight, except for the last phase. Ganon's health bar becomes enormous, stretching past his title to the end of the screen. With the sages and all clones out of the way, it's a simple sword fight between you and freedom for the Kingdom of Hyrule. The first time you flurry rush him, expecting to get a good amount of damage in. Tears of the Kingdom is a wonderfully designed video game. Everything about the way it's made, besides some parts of the main quests, are built around the idea that the player can choose what they want to do and how they want to do it, while still telling a much better story than its prequel. It does lose some of the simplicity, but Breath of the Wild wasn't great because it was simple. In fact, it was deceptively so. While the story was quite basic, the exploration and combat had incredible depth, all aspects that are improved upon in Tears of the Kingdom. The abilities are more useful than ever and can be used in a near limitless number of ways for puzzle solving and combat. Shrines encourage experimentation, and the dungeons do so, except are longer, more complex, have more story significance, and are environmentally themed. Exploration feeds into more exploration. A tower on the ground can send you into the sky. You can find a chest in the sky that'll give you a spot on your map for a treasure in the depths. Light routes make it easier to comb through an area you've already ran through, and towers help you figure out what potentially interesting areas might be. Combat gives you better gear, making you explore to find more enemies. Fusions help you get many different types of weapons and shields, especially when combined with Zonai devices. The towers are wonderful at not only giving you the map on your PSP, but they also literally show the whole region to you by shooting you into the sky. I really like the towers in this game. Pen's Quest gives you froggy armor, which allows you to climb and explore more in rainy areas. Treasure is abundant, and discovering something that you had no idea was even in the game feels great, especially since it still happens over 100 hours into the game. Even after I post this video, possibly years from now, I'll still be discovering new things, new fusions, ways to engage with the world in Tears of the Kingdom. It is a crowning achievement, not in graphics, or map size, or story, but in the one thing that matters most: the world. And this game's new type of double Korok, the one where you must carry one Captain Toad backpacked Korok to the other using Ultra Hand, or you could torture them forever. You could like attach like rockets to them, and you can probably drown them. I don't know.